When most people think about the start of World War II, they remember September 1st, 1939, the date Nazi Germany invaded Poland. This is the date we commemorate as the war's beginning. But there's another date that's equally important, yet far less known in the West: September the 17th, 1939. On this day, just over 2 weeks after Hitler's forces crossed into Poland from the west, Stalin's Red Army invaded from the east. Poland, already reeling from the German blitzkrieg, now faced an impossible situation, fighting the world's two most powerful totalitarian regimes simultaneously. Within weeks, Poland would cease to exist as an independent nation, partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in a cynical division that had been secretly planned weeks before the first shot was fired. This event would have profound consequences, not just for World War II, but for the entire Cold War era that followed. It began Poland's subjugation that would last, in one form or another, for 50 years. It revealed the true nature of Stalin's foreign policy, and it demonstrated the failure of the international system to protect smaller nations caught between aggressive great powers. Today, we'll examine the background to this invasion, the secret diplomacy that made it possible, the invasion itself, and its devastating consequences for millions of Polish citizens. Let's begin. To understand why Poland became a target for both Hitler and Stalin, we need to understand Poland's position in the interwar period. Poland had only regained independence in 1918, after 123 years of being partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The rebirth of the Polish state was one of the great achievements of World War I's aftermath, but Poland's independence was born in violence and surrounded by potential threats. Between 1918 and 1921, the new Polish state fought no fewer than 6 border wars with its neighbours. The most significant was the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921. In this conflict, Poland successfully defended itself against the Red Army and even pushed Soviet forces back, establishing Poland's eastern border well beyond the ethnic Polish territories, incorporating significant Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. This Polish victory was never forgotten or forgiven by the Soviets. Lenin and later Stalin viewed this defeat as a humiliation. The territory Poland gained included lands that Soviet leadership considered rightfully theirs. This created a deep-seated desire for revenge that would simmer for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, the rebirth of Poland also troubled Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had given Poland access to the Baltic Sea through the Polish Corridor, a strip of territory that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The predominantly German city of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, was made a free city under League of Nations protection. Germans across the political spectrum resented these territorial losses, so Poland found itself in an incredibly precarious geopolitical position, wedged between 2 revisionist powers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, both of whom had territorial claims and historical grievances against the Polish state. Poland was not a small country. It had a population of about 35 million and a respectable military. But it was not strong enough to fight both Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously. Polish foreign policy in the 1930s tried to navigate between these 2 threats. Poland signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1934 and maintained diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. But Polish leaders were under no illusions. They knew that both neighbours represented existential threats. The question was not whether one or both would eventually move against Poland, but when. By 1939, that question was about to be answered. The spring and summer of 1939 were filled with diplomatic crisis. Hitler made increasingly aggressive demands regarding Danzig and the Polish corridor. Britain and France finally recognizing that appeasement had failed after Germany occupied Czechoslovakia in March 1939, offered security guarantees to Poland. War seemed increasingly likely. But then came one of the most stunning diplomatic reversals in history. Throughout the 1930s, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were seen as ideological opposites, fascism versus communism. They had been on opposite sides of the Spanish Civil War. Hitler's anti-communist rhetoric was a cornerstone of Nazi ideology, and Soviet propaganda portrayed Nazi Germany as capitalism's most dangerous form. The idea that these two regimes might cooperate seemed absurd, yet both Hitler and Stalin were pragmatists when it suited them. And in August 1939, it suited them both to make a deal. For Hitler, the situation was clear. He wanted to attack Poland, but he desperately wanted to avoid a two-front war. If the Soviet Union remained neutral, or better yet, joined in dividing Poland, then Britain and France might hesitate to intervene, or their intervention would be ineffective. Hitler needed to neutralize the Soviet threat before moving west. For Stalin, the calculation was different but equally cynical. Stalin had been seeking an alliance with Britain and France against Germany. But these negotiations were going poorly. The British and French were half-hearted, suspicious of Stalin's motives, and unwilling to give the Soviets a free hand in Eastern Europe. Stalin began to believe that the Western powers wanted to turn Hitler eastward, toward the Soviet Union, while they remained safe. A deal with Hitler offered Stalin several advantages. It would buy time for the Soviet Union to prepare for an eventual conflict with Germany, which Stalin believed was inevitable. It would allow the Soviet Union to recover territories lost after World War I, including eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. And it would allow Stalin to watch from the sidelines as Germany fought Britain and France, weakening all the capitalist powers. On August 23, 1939, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in Moscow. Stalin himself attended the signing, a rare honor that demonstrated how important this agreement was to Soviet policy. Publicly, the pact was straightforward. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed not to attack each other for 10 years. They pledged neutrality if either became involved in a war with a third party. They agreed to resolve any disputes through negotiation. To a world still reeling from years of Nazi-Soviet hostility, this was shocking enough. Communist parties in Western countries, which had been some of the most vocal anti-Nazi voices, suddenly had to reverse course and portray Nazi Germany as acceptable. Many communist intellectuals left the party in disgust, but the real shock was secret. Attached to the public treaty was a confidential protocol that carved Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. This secret protocol, which the Soviet Union would deny existed until 1989, included the following provisions. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were designated as part of the Soviet sphere. Lithuania was initially placed in the German sphere, though this was later reversed. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of Poland, note the careful diplomatic language, the country would be divided roughly along the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. The Soviet sphere would include eastern Poland, incorporating approximately 200,000 square kilometers of territory. In Romania, the Soviet Union expressed interest in Bessarabia, and Germany declared its complete disinterest in that region. In other words, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland's fate was sealed before the first German tank crossed its border. The agreement was pure power politics of the most cynical kind, two dictators treating sovereign nations as territories to be traded like properties in a business deal. The secret protocol would not become public knowledge until after World War II. though Polish intelligence suspected something along these lines. The full text was not officially acknowledged by the Soviet Union until 1989, when Mikhail Gorbachev's government finally admitted to its existence. This pact made Hitler's invasion of Poland possible. On September 1st, 1939, German forces attacked. Britain and France, honouring their guarantees, declared war on Germany 2 days later. But they did not declare war on the Soviet Union when it invaded on September 17th, a discrepancy that the Soviets would exploit in their propaganda, claiming they were not really starting World War II, merely recovering lost territories. At 2 a.m. on September 17th, 1939, Soviet ambassador to Poland, Vyacheslav Sharonov, delivered a note to the Polish Deputy Foreign Minister, justifying the upcoming invasion. The note claimed that the Polish state had disintegrated and no longer existed. It stated that the Soviet Union therefore had an obligation to protect the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations of eastern Poland. This was pure propaganda. The Polish state, while in dire straits, had not ceased to exist. The government was functioning. Polish military units were still fighting. But the Soviets needed a pretext, however thin, and this was it. At dawn on September 17th, approximately 800,000 Soviet troops crossed Poland's eastern border. The force was organized into two fronts, the Belarusian front under Commander Mikhail Kovalev and the Ukrainian front under Commander Semyon Timoshenko. They advanced along a front stretching over 800 miles from north to south. The invasion force included 4,736 tanks, 3,300 armoured cars, and substantial artillery and air support. This was an overwhelming force against the limited Polish units stationed in the east. Polish forces in the east had received little warning. Most Polish military strength was concentrated in the west, fighting the Germans. The eastern regions were lightly defended, primarily by Border Protection Corps units and some regular army divisions that had retreated eastward. These forces were nowhere near sufficient to stop the Red Army. The Soviet advance was rapid. Encountering limited resistance, Soviet forces advanced 15 to 20 kilometers per day. Some Polish units, confused by contradictory orders and uncertain whether to treat the Soviets as enemies or potential allies against Germany, initially did not resist. The Polish High Command had not issued clear orders about how to respond to a Soviet invasion, partly because they had left Warsaw in chaos, partly because they hoped the Soviets might be persuaded to remain neutral. But it quickly became clear that the Soviet Union was not neutral. Soviet forces attacked Polish military units, seized Polish cities, and began arresting Polish soldiers and officials. Some Polish commanders decided to fight. The most significant battle occurred at Szak on September 28th, where Polish cavalry units under General Władysław Anders attacked Soviet forces, achieving a local victory before withdrawing. Other engagements occurred at Grodno, where Polish defenders held out until September the 22nd, and at Wilno, modern-day Vilnius, where Polish forces fought Soviet troops before surrendering. But these were isolated actions. Most Polish units in the east faced an impossible choice: fight a hopeless battle against overwhelming Soviet forces, try to break through to Hungary or Romania, to escape or surrender. Different commanders made different choices based on their specific circumstances. Approximately 230,000 to 240,000 Polish soldiers were captured by Soviet forces. These men were promised protection under international law as prisoners of war. Instead, they would face mass deportations, executions, and years in Soviet labour camps. The Soviet invasion also complicated Poland's relationship with the Western Allies. Britain and France had declared war on Germany after it invaded Poland, but they did not declare war on the Soviet Union. This was partly because the Soviet Union's pretext, that it was protecting minorities, not attacking a sovereign state, provided enough ambiguity to avoid automatic triggering of alliances. But it was also because Britain and France still hoped to eventually draw the Soviet Union into an anti-German alliance, and declaring war on the USSR would make that impossible. This created a painful irony. Poland was now fighting alone against two invaders, but only one of those invaders was at war with Poland's allies. The Soviet Union, despite invading Poland, was not officially at war with Britain or France. This diplomatic ambiguity would persist until Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, when Stalin suddenly became an Allied leader. By early October, all organised Polish military resistance had ended. Some Polish soldiers managed to escape to Hungary or Romania, from where many eventually made their way to France and later Britain. These soldiers would continue fighting throughout the war, serving with distinction in campaigns from North Africa to Italy to Normandy. The Polish Air Force in particular would play a crucial role in the Battle of Britain. But for those captured by the Soviets, or for the 13 million Polish citizens now living under Soviet occupation, the nightmare was just beginning. On September 28, 1939, with Poland now fully occupied, Ribbentrop returned to Moscow to sign a new agreement with Molotov, the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. This treaty finalized the partition line between German and Soviet zones of occupation. The new border was adjusted slightly from the original secret protocol. The final line gave the Soviet Union more Polish territory than initially planned, approximately 201,000 square kilometers, or about 52% of Poland's pre-war territory. This area included the cities of Lviv, Lwów, Wilno, Vilnius, Grodno, Brest and Białystok. About 13 million people lived in the Soviet zone, including approximately 5 million ethnic Poles, 4.5 million Ukrainians, 1.5 million Belarusians, and about 1 million Jews. The treaty also included secret protocols about crushing Polish resistance and preventing any revival of the Polish state. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to suppress any Polish agitation in their respective zones and to coordinate their efforts to eliminate Polish national identity. The Soviets moved quickly to transform their occupied territories. Within weeks, they organized staged elections in which voters were given a single list of approved candidates and asked to vote on whether to request incorporation into the Soviet Union. Unsurprisingly, these elections reported overwhelming support, often over 90%, for joining the USSR. On November 1st to 2nd, 1939, the Supreme Soviet formally incorporated Eastern Poland into the Soviet Union. The northern portion was attached to the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, while the southern portion was attached to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. From the Soviet legal perspective, these territories had never really been Polish. They were merely Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, temporarily occupied by Poland. This was, of course, a fiction. While these territories did have significant Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, they also had millions of Poles who had lived there for generations. Moreover, the incorporation violated international law and all norms of sovereignty. Poland had not ceded these territories, they were taken by force. The Soviet occupation brought immediate changes to daily life. Private property was abolished. Factories, farms and businesses were nationalized. The Soviet ruble replaced the Polish zloty. Soviet administrative systems were imposed. Schools were required to teach in Ukrainian, Belarusian or Russian, not Polish. Churches faced restrictions or closure. But these economic and social changes, disruptive as they were, paled in comparison to the terror that accompanied Soviet rule. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, moved into occupied Poland in force. They began compiling lists of socially dangerous elements who needed to be eliminated or neutralized. These lists included Polish military officers and police, Polish government officials and civil servants, landowners and business owners, teachers and professors, priests and religious leaders, political activists of all non-communist parties, and anyone suspected of being able to organize resistance to Soviet rule. The NKVD worked systematically, using informants, interrogations, and records seized from Polish authorities. They divided targets into categories, with different fates assigned to each category. Night arrests became common. NKVD agents would arrive at homes in the early morning hours, conduct quick searches, and take people away. Families often had no idea what had happened to their relatives, whether they were in prison, deported, or executed. The scale of Soviet repression in occupied Poland was enormous. Estimates suggest that between September 1939 and June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets arrested approximately 100,000 to 150,000 people in the occupied territories. Of these, roughly 30,000 were executed. The rest were sent to labour camps in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. But the arrests were only part of the story. The Soviets also implemented mass deportations of entire families and communities. Between February 1940 and June 1941, the Soviet authorities conducted 4 major waves of deportations from occupied Poland. The total number of deportees remains disputed, but credible estimates range from 1 million to 1.5 million people. The first deportation occurred in February 1940 and targeted approximately 220,000 people, primarily forestry workers, settlers, and their families living in the border regions. These people were accused of being colonizers planted by the Polish government. The second deportation in April 1940 involved approximately 320,000 people, primarily families of military officers, police, civil servants, and others already arrested. The Soviet logic was simple: eliminate not just potential resistance leaders, but their entire families who might seek revenge. The third deportation in June-July 1940 targeted approximately 240,000 refugees who had fled to Soviet-occupied Poland from German-occupied areas. Ironically, many of these were Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, hoping for safety in the Soviet zone. Instead, they were deported as unreliable elements. A fourth, smaller deportation occurred in May-June 1941, just weeks before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, targeting approximately 100,000 additional people. The deportation process was brutal and systematic. NKVD units would surround villages or city blocks at night. Families were given between 20 minutes to 2 hours to pack whatever they could carry. Protests were met with violence. Deportees were loaded onto freight trains, often cattle cars, with minimal food, water, or sanitation facilities. The journey to exile typically lasted several weeks. Deportees travelled in overcrowded, unheated cars through the depths of winter or the heat of summer. Many, especially the elderly and young children, died during transport. Destinations included the Siberian taiga, the steppes of Kazakhstan, the Komi Republic, and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. Deportees were forced to work in logging camps, mines, collective farms, and construction projects under harsh conditions. Food was insufficient, medical care was nearly non-existent, and living conditions were barely survivable. Mortality rates among deportees were staggering. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 30% of those deported died during the first year of exile from disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure. Families were often separated. Children were placed in Soviet orphanages, where they were given Russian names and taught to forget their Polish identity. The deportation served multiple purposes for the Soviet regime. They removed potential resistance leaders and hostile populations from strategically important border regions. They provided forced labour for ambitious Soviet economic projects in underpopulated regions. And they began the process of cultural destruction, breaking up Polish communities and dispersing them across the vast Soviet territory, where they could be more easily controlled and assimilated. These deportations represent one of the great crimes of the Stalin era, often overshadowed by the Holocaust, but equally devastating for those who experienced them. Entire communities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Cultural and social networks that had existed for centuries were obliterated. And this was all occurring while Poland's western regions were undergoing similar horrors under Nazi occupation. Poland was being crushed between two totalitarian millstones, each trying to eliminate Polish national identity through slightly different methods. Among all the crimes committed by the Soviet Union against Poland, none is more infamous than the Katyn massacre. In September and October 1939, the Red Army captured approximately 250,000 Polish military personnel. Most were eventually released, but about 25,700 officers, police, and intellectuals were held in special NKVD camps. The Soviets separated officers from regular soldiers, recognizing that educated military leaders represented a particular threat to Soviet control of Poland. These prisoners were held in three main camps: Kozelsk, Ostashkov, and Starobelsk. The NKVD interrogated them extensively, trying to identify their political views and potential usefulness to the Soviet regime. In March 1940, NKVD chief Lavrenti Beria sent a proposal to Stalin recommending that these Polish prisoners be executed. Beria's memorandum argued that these men were hardened and uncompromising enemies of Soviet authority, who should be tried by special tribunals and sentenced to death. On March 5, 1940, Stalin and the Politburo approved Beria's proposal. This decision sealed the fate of approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, intellectuals, and other enemies of the Soviet state. Over the following weeks, prisoners were taken in small groups from the camps, told they were being transferred or released, and transported to execution sites. The largest killing took place in the Katyn forest near Smolensk, where approximately 4,400 Polish officers were shot in the back of the head and buried in mass graves. Similar massacres occurred at other locations: Kalinin, now Tver, where about 6,300 were killed; Kharkiv, where about 3,800 were killed, and various other sites across the Western Soviet Union. The victims included not just military officers, but also doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, and other educated professionals who happened to be serving as reserve officers. This was not just military decimation, it was the systematic elimination of Poland's educated elite, the very people who would be needed to rebuild an independent Poland after the war. The Soviets attempted to hide this crime. They destroyed records, concealed the burial sites, and created false paper trails suggesting the prisoners had been transferred to other camps. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Nazis occupied the Katyn area. In 1943, German authorities discovered the mass graves and, recognizing a propaganda opportunity, announced the discovery to the world. They invited international observers, including representatives from the International Red Cross, to examine the evidence. The Soviets immediately denied responsibility, claiming the Germans had committed the massacre after occupying the area. This became the official Soviet position for nearly 50 years. The Soviet Union insisted that Nazi Germany was responsible for Katyn, and anyone who suggested otherwise was denounced as a fascist propagandist. This created an extraordinarily painful situation for Poland's wartime government in exile. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets and the Western Allies became partners against Hitler. Poland's government in exile was pressured by Britain and the United States not to press the Katyn issue too hard, as it might damage the Allied coalition. When the Polish government in exile requested an independent investigation through the International Red Cross, Stalin used this as a pretext to break diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile, claiming they were collaborating with Nazi propaganda. After the war, with Poland firmly under Soviet control, the Katyn massacre became a forbidden topic in Poland. For decades, Poles knew the truth, that the Soviets, not the Germans, had murdered their officers, but were forbidden to say so publicly. The massacre became a symbol of the lies and repression that characterized Soviet-controlled Poland. Only in 1990, during Gorbachev's glasnost reforms, did the Soviet Union finally admit responsibility for the Katyn massacre. Russian President Boris Yeltsin released documentation proving Stalin's direct approval of the executions. In 2010, the Russian Duma officially condemned the massacre as a crime ordered by Stalin. The Katyn massacre was not just a war crime, it was an attempt to decapitate Polish society, eliminating the educated leadership needed for national survival. Combined with the deportations and arrests, Soviet policy aimed at destroying Poland as a national entity, ensuring that any future Poland would be weak, dependent, and unable to resist Soviet domination. While we focused on the Polish experience, it's important to understand how the Soviet invasion of Poland fit into Stalin's broader strategic goals. The Nazi-Soviet pact and the invasion of Poland were not isolated events. Between 1939 and 1941, Stalin pursued an aggressive expansion of Soviet territory and influence across Eastern Europe. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. The Soviets demanded territorial concessions from Finland, and when Finland refused, the Red Army attacked. Finland resisted fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties on Soviet forces and embarrassing the Red Army. Eventually, Finland was forced to cede territory, but maintained its independence, the only country in the Soviet sphere that managed to do so. In June 1940, as France fell to Germany and the world's attention focused westward, the Soviet Union issued ultimatums to the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Soviet troops occupied all three countries, staged elections similar to those in Poland, and formally incorporated them into the USSR. The independent Baltic states simply ceased to exist. Also in June 1940, the Soviet Union forced Romania to cede the territories of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, which were incorporated into Soviet Ukraine and formed into the new Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. By mid-1940, the Soviet Union had expanded westward by approximately 500,000 square kilometers, incorporating roughly 23 million people into Soviet territory. Stalin had achieved in less than a year what the Russian Empire had failed to do in World War I: establish Soviet control over Eastern Europe's borderlands. This expansion provided the Soviet Union with strategic depth, buffer territories between the Soviet heartland and Germany. It gave the USSR control of important resources and industrial centers, and it fulfilled historic Russian imperial ambitions to control the approaches to Russia's western borders. But this expansion came at a terrible human cost: deportations, executions, and the suppression of multiple national identities. And it created deep resentment among the affected populations. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, many in these occupied territories initially welcomed the Germans as liberators, a welcome that quickly turned to horror as Nazi brutality became apparent. For 2 years, from September 1939 to June 1941, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Both occupiers pursued policies of terror and cultural destruction, though with different emphasis. In German-occupied Poland, Nazi racial ideology was paramount. The Germans viewed Slavs as racially inferior and destined for enslavement or elimination. They immediately began arresting and executing Polish intellectuals, priests, and community leaders in operations like abou action. They closed Polish schools and universities, seized property, and deported Poles from annexed territories to make room for German settlers. And they began concentrating Poland's Jewish population in ghettos, the first step toward genocide. In Soviet-occupied Poland, class ideology rather than race was the organizing principle. The Soviets targeted landowners, business owners, military officers, and intellectuals not because of their ethnicity, but because of their class position and potential for resistance. Soviet policy aimed to eliminate the Polish social elite and replace it with a loyal Soviet-controlled administrative class. Both occupiers banned Polish cultural activities, closed Polish institutions, and attempted to erase Polish identity. Poland's situation was unique in occupied Europe. It was the only country to be simultaneously occupied by both totalitarian regimes, each pursuing genocidal policies. Polish civilians developed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Underground educational networks continued teaching Polish history and culture in secret. Underground newspapers circulated news from the outside world. Resistance networks formed to help those targeted by both occupiers, but survival was a daily struggle. Food was scarce, arbitrary arrests were common, and trust was dangerous. Informants were everywhere. Families were torn apart, with some members in German territory, others in Soviet territory, and communication nearly impossible. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the entire territory of Poland fell under German control. For Jews, this meant the beginning of the Holocaust. For other Poles, it sometimes meant a change from one form of oppression to another. Some of those deported by the Soviets were eventually released after the Nazi invasion and allowed to join Polish military units forming in the USSR under British command. The Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939 had profound and lasting consequences. Most immediately, it ensured Poland's defeat and occupation. Poland might not have been able to defeat Germany alone, but the simultaneous Soviet invasion made any continued resistance impossible. It demonstrated the failure of collective security and the vulnerability of smaller nations caught between aggressive great powers. The invasion revealed the true nature of Stalin's foreign policy, that Stalin was willing to collaborate with Hitler when it served Soviet interests, that he was pursuing traditional Russian imperial goals dressed up in communist ideology, and that he had no respect for the sovereignty of neighbouring states. The occupation that followed, with its deportations, executions, and cultural suppression, created lasting trauma and resentment that poisoned Soviet-Polish relations for generations. Even after the Soviet Union joined the Allies in 1941, Poles never forgot that the Soviets had been their enemies first. After World War II, Stalin ensured that Poland remained under Soviet domination. The government in exile, based in London, was not allowed to return. Instead, a Soviet-backed communist government was installed. Poland's borders were shifted westward. The Soviet Union kept most of the territories seized in 1939, while Poland received former German territories in the west as compensation. Poland would not regain genuine sovereignty until 1989, when the communist system finally collapsed. The 50-year period of Soviet domination began with the invasion of September 17, 1939. In historical memory, the Soviet invasion has been overshadowed by the Holocaust and other atrocities of World War II. In the West, September 1, 1939, is remembered as the start of the war, while September 17th is often forgotten. But for Poles, both dates are equally significant. Poland was attacked by both totalitarian powers and suffered under both. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the invasion it enabled demonstrated that totalitarian regimes, despite ideological differences, can collaborate in pursuit of power. The pact collapsed when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, confirming that the alliance was purely opportunistic. But for 2 years it reshaped Eastern Europe. Today, the Soviet invasion remains a painful memory and a source of tension. Russia's current government, while acknowledging Soviet crimes, is sensitive about narratives that equate Soviet and Nazi aggression. But for Poland and other Eastern European